This is going to be a comparison of the Trek Marlin and the Boardman Team FS. Now, this may seem like an unlikely match, but I'll be using them both for general trail riding, and it should make sense if I give you a bit of historical context. I got interested in mountain biking about 4 years ago, and with no real idea of what to buy, I decided full suspension was going to be better than half suspension, and I ended up with the Boardman. Actually, it wasn't this Boardman. I started out with a 2009 Comp FS, but I traded up to a Team FS a couple of years on, mainly because I wanted to go up a frame size. This is a 19-inch frame. This bike's a 2011 Team FS, and as of July 2013 it's still a current model. The Marlin is a 2013 model, and one of the reasons I decided to buy it was I'd started looking around at other bikes, and I began to wonder if the Boardman was maybe over specified for what I was using it for. There were more specific reasons too, which I'll say more about as we go. My basic requirement was a fairly simple one. I enjoy being outdoors, and I wanted a go anywhere sort of bike that would get me out in the countryside whatever the season. I should probably qualify that. I live in Luton, so go anywhere means anywhere in Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire, and I was looking primarily at riding on bridleways and back roads. Now, as with any marginally technical pastime, there's a huge amount of jargon attached to mountain biking, and that extends to terrain types, and by implication to types of bikes that are presumed to be specialised to those terrains. I'm not really interested in all that, so whatever you see in this video I'm just going to call trail riding, and each of the bikes you see here is what's generally considered a trail bike. Anyway, having done a bit of research, the Boardman bike's got good press, and that's what I went for. So this is a full suspension bike with rock shocks at both ends and hydraulic disc brakes. The forks are Sector TK, and this is the Solo Air version, which is an air sprung and oil damped fork. It has adjustable rebound damping and comes with a turnkey lockout for the fork, hence TK. Now, I've actually replaced this with a remote lockout, which also adds the RockShox motion control cartridge to the fork and essentially turns it into a Sector RL. Because this is an air sprung shock, you can tailor the stiffness to your weight and preferences by adding or bleeding air through a valve on the crown. The same goes for the rear shock, which is a RockShox Monarch, and which also has adjustable rebound damping. The rear shock can't be locked, so you do get some bobbing under pedalling. The shocks do two different jobs, smoothing out the bumps but also keeping the wheels in contact with the ground for as much of the time as possible, and hence maximising traction. To be honest, the subtleties are probably wasted on me, and I tend to leave the damping wound down so the suspension can move quickly enough to soak up the corrugated iron type of texture you get on a lot of these bridleways, especially when the ground's as hard as it is here. But on most terrain the ride is very smooth, and the fork travels more than enough for my purposes. Again, I'm probably the limiting factor, as on anything that's going to bottom out the forks I'm likely to be hanging out over the back wheel and dragging the brakes. Those brakes, by the way, are fantastic. These are Avid Elixir 3s, hydraulic of course, and although you can easily lock either wheel with one or two fingers, you'll be doing it deliberately because the brakes are so progressive and controllable. These are mid-range hydraulic brakes in Avid's range, and you're only going to outride them if you're pushing them hard enough to overheat, which I tend not to be. They're high tech of course, and if you wreck one out on the trail, say by snagging a hose on something, you're not going to be able to fix it in the field. Hydraulic brakes also incur a bit more of a maintenance overhead, but when they're working well these ones are absolutely brilliant. We've got 20 gears, which means 10 cogs on the back and 2 on the front. Personally, I've found this a bit more finicky than an 8 or 9 cog rear, although this may be about my shifting habits. I do tend to stay on the outer front chain wheel for a lot of the time. So that's a basic once-over of the Boardman, and I really have nothing bad to say about this bike, or at least nothing that I wouldn't be saying about any bike in its class. The gearing, for example, is too low, and I probably spend most of my time in the top 3 or 4 gears. This is off-road as well as on, by the way, and it's not unusual to be going uphill, even on dirt, and wishing I could click up a couple more times. The gear ratio is pretty standard for a mountain bike. That's 11 teeth on the back in top gear and 42 on the front, and changing that by swapping out components doesn't seem to be as straightforward as I thought it might be. Now another slight nag is those hydraulic brakes. Although it's easy in principle to change the pads, for example, that doesn't mean it's easy in practice, and I've found I can't always get the pistons to go back into the caliper, in which case it's physically impossible to get new pads onto the disc. The pistons can also stick if they get dirty, and of course the fluid needs replacing and the system bleeding from time to time. In truth, hydraulic brakes are barely user serviceable, and certainly for the average user. Over time I did begin to wonder if I really needed all that technology, and I had a hankering to experiment. I've always wanted to try a hardtail too, that's a bike without a rear shock, and gradually I talked myself into looking around for another bike. So my basic shopping list was a budget hardtail with mechanical disc brakes instead of hydraulic, and I also decided on 29-inch wheels, more on that in a while. And looking around at what was available, I settled on the Trek Marlin. As I said earlier, this is a 2013 model, and to be honest I wasn't wild about its looks, although it looks a lot better in the flesh than it does on the page. But Trek's a name brand and has a lifetime warranty on its frames. The wheels are respectable too, with double-walled rims and stainless spokes. Now this isn't going to be a like-for-like comparison. The Boardman's £1,000 bike and this one cost half that, so we can expect some cost cutting on the components. Weight-wise, there isn't much difference between the two. This means the Marlin's on the heavy side for a hardtail, but in practice that's barely relevant. The fact is I'm the heaviest component of either bike, and an extra kilo here or there only represents about 1% of the total weight. Part of that weight penalty comes from the big wheels and a bigger fork. This is a 29er, which means it has significantly more metal in the wheels and more rubber in the tyres. It also has the kind of cheap fork you find on a budget bike. This is a Sun Tour XCM, and this likely accounts for some of the extra weight. First impressions are this is a roomy bike with pretty much the same riding position as the Boardman. The 29er marketing machine tells us that big wheels roll more easily over bumpy bits, but the difference isn't in your face obvious, and early impressions show no great differences in the handling. This bike has G2 geometry written all over it, which as far as I can make out means the headstock angle and the fork offset are matched to spice up the naturally slower steering of bigger wheels and approximate the handling of a 26er. I'm not sure what implications this might have for upgrading the forks, and a quick survey shows the choice of 29er forks is relatively limited and they're all quite pricey. But if there's no huge difference in handling, this bike does seem to roll more freely, although I'd guess that's partly down to the tyres, which are skinnier and less knobbly than the Boardman's. These are 2-inch tyres, by the way, not the 2.1 inches quoted by Trek for this bike. I haven't had an opportunity to ride them in mud as yet. We're having a heat wave at the moment, but they seem competent enough on dirt. This bike is noticeably quicker and smoother on the road, again largely down to the tyres, but there's another useful consequence of those bigger wheels. Although the top gear ratio is the same as the Boardman, 11 teeth at the back and 42 on the front, each revolution of those wheels takes us about 9.5 inches further along the road. That means the effective gear ratio is about 11% higher, and that's roughly equivalent to putting a 47 tooth sprocket on the front of the Boardman instead of 42. Good news. On this bike we have 8 cogs on the back and 3 on the front, but otherwise it works more or less the same as on the Boardman. The pedals I have on here aren't the standard ones, by the way. Those are cheap plastic ones that I swapped out straight away for a set of DMR Volts. Now, I did think the Boardman's pedals were pretty much ideal, but that changed once I tried the Volts. The Boardman has cast alloy pedals made by Welgo, and I think these are copies of the DMR V12s, and they're actually quite slippery in the wet. The Volts are significantly bigger, which is more comfortable if you have relatively soft shoes on, and they have screw-in blobs around the edges to prevent slippage. This is also true of the real DMR V12s, but on the Welgo knockoffs those blobs are just part of the casting and they're actually kind of rounded, and they don't help a lot in the wet. The cranks on the Marlin are Shimano's, and they turn a cheap sealed bottom bracket. This is a square taper cartridge and it looks a bit unfinished with all this exposed metal showing. I actually thought there was a bit missing at first, so this is a bit of a cosmetic letdown for an otherwise quite smart looking bike. This is a much cheaper component than the Boardman's bottom bracket, which has external bearings and costs 4 or 5 times as much. On the other hand, the Trek one's pretty much disposable, so you can just replace it or think about upgrading when it wears out. I have to say the ride's noticeably harsher off-road on this bike than it is on the Boardman. We've got to expect that on very rough ground, of course, because we don't have a shock on the back, but that fork's also pretty stiff. This is a coil spring shock rather than air sprung, and although we do get a preload adjuster, it doesn't really make a lot of difference, and the range seems to vary between very firm and extremely firm, you might say. I was quite surprised actually, because a lot of reports suggest that this fork is very sloppy and soft, so maybe that's what's to come. There's no damping adjustment, but we do get a lockout to prevent bobbing. Now there's one big difference here from the Boardman, which is that this is a mechanical lockout, and this means you can't lock it or unlock it on the move. This makes a big difference because you have to completely unload the fork to turn the lockout, and this usually means stopping and standing up. If you're adept at wheelies, your mileage may vary. The other big part of this experiment, of course, is the brakes, and again we find a big difference from the Boardman. Now remember, we're not comparing like for like, so these are budget mechanical disc brakes, while the Boardmans are mid-range hydraulics. The brakes on this bike are Tektro Novellas, which are bottom of the barrel disc brakes. That said, they're probably not as bad as you've read. In reading reviews of the Marlin, I'd more or less resigned myself to having to replace these, but now I'm not so sure. First impressions were that they were terrible, but after 3 trips they're starting to bed in, and they actually work pretty well. The back brake seems to work better than the front, and I've noticed the front action feels springier than the back. I don't know whether this is at the lever or the caliper, and maybe by design, I don't know. Anyway, now they've scrubbed in, the brakes are quite progressive, but there's no doubt that you have to pull harder than on the Boardman's brakes, and that's probably an understatement. You have to pull a lot harder. But for this kind of riding it's okay, at least in the dry. So we'll see how it goes, and I'll reserve the option to upgrade if these turn out to be duds in the long term. But as a proof of concept, I've got no doubt that mechanical discs will easily give me what I need for this kind of riding, and maintenance wise these are completely user serviceable. So where does all that leave us? Well, if I'd bought the Marlin first, I'm pretty sure I'd have considered it up to the job. It's a pleasure to ride, and I'm just getting used to its particular foibles. I haven't done any objective comparisons of the ride quality, but I've ridden both bikes over a couple of my regular routes to get a bit of a sense of how they compare. The Trek's undoubtedly more bone shaking on the rougher bits, although how much of this is down to the fork and how much to the absence of a rear shock, only time will tell. I like its longer legs on the road and the smoother trails, but I miss the Boardman's softer ride and the hydraulic fork lockout. Time will tell if those bigger wheels make any noticeable difference beyond raising the gearing, but I'm thinking it should at least be easier to get the tyres on and off when I get a puncture. I'll likely try fatter tyres when these ones wear out. And for the brakes, I'll be looking at Avid BB7s if I'm going to hang on to this bike in the longer term. These are generally considered to be just about as good as hydraulic brakes. And ultimately that fork must be a candidate for an upgrade. But we'll see how it goes, and it might soften up as it beds in. So those are the bikes. With the Marlin you get what you pay for, which is a solid frame and 29-inch wheels, with basic equipment everywhere else waiting to be upgraded when it wears out. The Boardman, by contrast, is complete out of the box, and anyone who describes it as a crappy Halfords bike likely hasn't been near one. In my view, this is an excellent all-round trail machine, and far more capable than I am as a rider. But the Marlin 2 is completely rideable as it comes, and it's a great basic package to upgrade as you go. For basic trail riding, as you see here, either of these bikes is more than up to the job.